Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into something that's been on my mind lately, and I think it's worth having an honest conversation about. The question I want to explore is whether economic pressure is fundamentally changing how Americans think about social and political issues. Are we at a point where financial survival is overshadowing everything else? Let's talk about it. So first, let me be clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not suggesting that caring about social justice, equality, or progressive causes is some kind of luxury hobby. That would be dismissive and honestly pretty insulting to the millions of people who fought for basic rights throughout history, often while facing extreme poverty themselves. What I am asking is whether there's a shift happening right now in this specific economic moment where people are reprioritizing what they can afford to focus on, both mentally and practically. Think about it this way. In 2020, we saw massive protests, widespread corporate statements about diversity and inclusion, and what felt like a cultural reckoning. Companies were falling over themselves to show how progressive they were. People were having difficult conversations at dinner tables across the country. There was this sense that we were finally addressing systemic issues that had been ignored for too long. But fast forward to today, and something feels different. The energy has shifted. And I don't think that's because people suddenly stopped caring. I think it's because they're drowning. Let me paint you a picture of what's happening economically. The average American is dealing with inflation that's made groceries feel like a luxury shopping trip. Rent has skyrocketed in ways that would have seemed impossible just 5 years ago. We're talking about cities where a one-bedroom apartment costs more than what people used to pay for mortgages on actual houses. Student loan debt is crushing an entire generation. Healthcare costs are still a nightmare, with people rationing insulin and avoiding doctor visits because they can't afford the copay. Gas prices yo-yo in ways that make budgeting nearly impossible. And all of this is happening while wages have barely budged for most workers. Now layer on top of that the fact that savings have been depleted. During the pandemic, a lot of families burned through whatever financial cushion they had. The emergency funds are gone. The credit cards are maxed out. People are living paycheck to paycheck and not just minimum wage workers anymore. We're talking about people with college degrees, people in professional jobs, people who thought they were doing everything right. The middle class is getting squeezed from every direction, and the stress is absolutely real. So here's where it gets interesting. When you're in survival mode, when you're genuinely worried about keeping a roof over your head and food on the table, your brain literally changes how it processes information. This isn't some kind of moral failing. It's psychology. When you're stressed about money, when you're in that constant state of financial anxiety, your bandwidth for other concerns shrinks. You become hyper-focused on immediate threats. And that makes perfect sense from an evolutionary standpoint, right? Your brain is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, which is prioritize survival. This doesn't mean people become heartless or stop believing in equality or justice. But it does mean they might not have the energy to engage with every social issue with the same intensity. They might tune out conversations that feel abstract when their own situation feels desperately concrete. When someone's working 2 jobs just to make ends meet, when they're lying awake at night wondering if they'll be able to afford their kids' school supplies, they might not have the mental space to dive deep into debates about representation in media or corporate diversity initiatives. And here's something else that's happening. There's a growing sense of resentment that's building, and we need to talk about it honestly. When people are struggling financially, and they see corporations or institutions that spent years making grand statements about social responsibility, but those same institutions aren't paying living wages or are laying off workers to boost profit margins, it creates cynicism. People start to feel like they were sold a bill of goods. Like all that talk about values was just marketing, just a way to look good while the fundamental economic exploitation continued unchanged. This isn't about pitting economic justice against social justice. In fact, they're deeply interconnected. But the framing matters. When progressive causes are presented in ways that feel disconnected from people's immediate economic pain, or worse, when it seems like focusing on those causes is happening instead of addressing economic inequality, people check out. They start to feel like the conversation isn't for them, isn't about them, doesn't include their struggles. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're someone working in a warehouse, doing back-breaking labor for barely above minimum wage. You can't afford health insurance through your job. You're one car breakdown away from financial catastrophe. And you're seeing companies spend millions on glossy ad campaigns about their commitment to various social causes, while your wages haven't increased in years and your hours just got cut. How do you think that feels? It's not that you don't care about those causes. It's that you feel invisible. Your suffering doesn't seem to count. And that creates a disconnect that's hard to bridge. Now, some people might say this is exactly why we need to talk about intersectionality, about how economic oppression and other forms of oppression are linked. And that's absolutely true. But here's the challenge. When people are in crisis, they're not always in a place to engage with complex theoretical frameworks. They need immediate relief. They need someone to acknowledge that they're hurting right now, today, and that something needs to change right now, today. There's also a political dimension to this that we can't ignore. We've seen a shift in voting patterns, particularly among working-class voters, that reflects this economic anxiety. People are voting for candidates who they think will address their financial pain, even if those candidates don't align with them on other issues. And you can judge that decision if you want, but it's worth understanding where it's coming from. When you're desperate, when you feel like the system has failed you, you're willing to take a gamble on someone who at least acknowledges your struggle, even if their solutions might not actually work. The truth is, there's a class dimension to how we discuss social and political issues in America that doesn't get talked about enough. A lot of these conversations happen in spaces, physical and digital, that are dominated by people who have some level of economic security. People who can afford to think beyond next month's rent. And that's not a criticism of those people or those conversations. But it does mean there's sometimes a disconnect between the discourse and the lived reality of millions of Americans. I've seen this play out in really interesting ways online. You'll see viral posts about the importance of various social causes, and the comments will be full of people saying essentially, "I agree with you in principle, but I can't eat principles. I can't pay my rent with good intentions. I need material change in my life right now." And those comments often get dismissed as missing the point or being reactionary. But I think they're expressing something real and important. They're saying that the hierarchy of needs is real, and right now, they're stuck on the bottom rungs. Here's another layer. Mental health is collapsing under economic pressure. We're seeing record levels of anxiety, depression, and burnout. When people are mentally and emotionally exhausted from just trying to survive, they don't have the capacity for sustained engagement with complex social issues. This isn't laziness or apathy. It's depletion. You can't pour from an empty cup, as the saying goes, and a lot of cups are bone dry right now. But here's what's fascinating and maybe gives us some hope. Throughout history, some of the most powerful social movements have emerged from places of economic desperation. The labor movement, the civil rights movement, these weren't led by people with economic security. They were led by people who were suffering and decided that enough was enough. So maybe the question isn't whether Americans are too poor to be woke, but rather, what happens when economic desperation becomes the catalyst for demanding comprehensive change? Because here's the thing. When people are suffering economically, they become very clear-eyed about power. They start asking who benefits from the current system and why. They start questioning why we have enough money for tax cuts for corporations, but not enough for healthcare or education. They start wondering why CEO pay has skyrocketed while wages stagnated. Economic pain can actually radicalize people, not in the sense of extremism, but in the sense of getting to the root of problems. Maybe what we're seeing isn't people caring less about social issues, but people demanding that those conversations be grounded in material reality. That we talk about justice in terms that include economic justice. That we acknowledge that you can't have true equality in a system where some people can't afford to see a doctor while others own multiple yachts. That dignity includes economic dignity, the ability to work a full-time job and afford a decent life. So where does this leave us? I think we're at an inflection point. Either we find ways to bridge these conversations, to show how economic justice and social justice are part of the same fight, or we're going to see continued fragmentation and frustration. People need to feel seen in their entirety, including their economic struggles. They need solutions that address their immediate pain while also working toward long-term systemic change. The challenge for anyone who cares about social progress is to meet people where they are, to acknowledge that someone working multiple jobs to survive isn't going to have the same capacity for activism as someone with financial security and free time, to recognize that economic anxiety is a real and pressing issue that deserves the same urgency we bring to other forms of injustice, to stop treating economic concerns and social concerns as separate categories when they're fundamentally intertwined. What do you think? Are we seeing a shift in priorities driven by economic desperation, or is something else going on? How do we build movements that address both immediate economic pain and long-term systemic change? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious to hear your perspectives, especially if you felt this tension in your own life. And if you found this conversation valuable, hit that like button and subscribe for more content where we tackle difficult questions honestly. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.